Iran thought it had won. The nation had absorbed the thousands of strikes that came with Operation Epic Fury, and its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz had created so much oil price pressure that the US was forced to negotiate. An evil regime still stood, and soon things would be back to normal for the morphed mullahs of Iran. Then the mountains exploded, and everything changed. But it's not the US that Iran's regime will have to worry about. Something else is coming. 5 Kurdish armies are on their way to wipe the regime out, and the danger from within now looks more lethal than the fire from above. It all started with reports of deaths within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. On June 30th, news broke that the previous few days had seen several armed skirmishes in Iran that had led to the deaths of 4 Iranian security personnel, along with injuries to several others. Among the dead were 2 members of the IRGC, the Jerusalem Post reported, in what Iranian authorities are already calling armed terrorist attacks. But it's where these attacks took place that deserves notice. The 2 IRGC members died in Pava, which is a border city in Iran's Kermanshah province. The other 2 casualties, who were both police officers, died of wounds sustained in shootings in Bana, which is in Iran's Kurdistan province. Clashes have also happened in Mahabad and Marivan, the outlet reports. These locations matter. All of these incidents took place in the mountainous terrain of western Iran where the Kurds live, and they were spread out far and wide. Mahabad and Marivan are about 230 kilometers apart, with Bana between them. Pava is 100 kilometers south of Marivan, but all are in or around Kurdish territory, and that's the connective tissue that runs through all of this. Something is brewing in Iran right now. As more time has passed since this initial flurry of attacks, more information has emerged about what's going on in the mountains of western Iran. Rumors are emerging that these 4 attacks are far from isolated incidents. They're spread across over 200 kilometers of Zagros Mountains territory, and they're part of a larger movement of strikes that are all occurring across territory in which Kurdish fighters have operated for decades. That's a hint of what's to come for Iran's regime. The Kurds, whom that regime has brutalized for so long, seem to have finally gotten their act together and are now launching coordinated assaults against the IRGC and other Iranian authorities throughout their territory. And worse yet for Iran, the Kurds have already claimed a big scalp, allegedly. On June 30th, right around the time that the 4 attacks were happening, Iran Wire reported on a strange incident that had occurred on the highways of the Kerman province. On June 29th, Mohammed Akbarzade's vehicle reportedly flipped over. He suffered severe injuries at the scene, and despite being taken to hospital, Akbarzadeh died a few hours later. Why does all of this matter? Akbarzadeh was a Rear Admiral 2nd Class and was also the political deputy of the Representative Office of the Supreme Leader in the IRGC Navy. In other words, he was the precise type of high-profile figure that you would expect to be targeted by Kurdish militants if those militants are ramping up their efforts to kick the IRGC and Iran's regime out of the seat of power for good. Of course, Iran claims this was all an accident. Akbarzadeh rolled his car, no more than that, nothing to see here. But Iran's higher-ups have a strange tendency to die in car accidents, and the timing of all of this is just far too coincidental. Granted, Kerman is in Iran's southeast, far away from the attacks that have been occurring in and around Kurdish territory, but a major IRGC figure dying when the IRGC and Iran's security forces are battling Kurds fits far too well to be ignored. What Iran has on its hands now may not just be localized aggression from some Kurdish upstarts, it could be the start of a revolution. And if it is, there has never been a better time than now for the Kurds to rise up and take on Iran's regime. The IRGC claims this is all about terrorism, isolated acts of aggression that are going to be put down. If we ignore the hypocrisy in that statement from an organization that is as terrorist as they come, the IRGC has attempted to respond. As Iran International reported on June 30th, the IRGC claims that it killed 6 armed men during a clash close to Iran's northwestern border, somewhere in the mountains between Mahabad and Piran Shah. Again, this is Kurdish territory, and if the IRGC is to be believed, the 6-person team was carrying weapons and military equipment with the goal of carrying out sabotage and terrorist operations. This shouldn't be seen as a success for the IRGC, it should be a sign. A new front is opening up in the war that has engulfed Iran, and it's not the US that is opening it. Iran's Kurds are going on the attack, and this initial spate of skirmishes is just the starting point for something much larger than the IRGC will be able to handle. According to Newsweek, the Norway-based Hengor Organization for Human Rights says the Pave strike was carried out by a Kurdish group called Kori Hiwa, which means Son of Hope. That group is newly formed, the organization says, and it's far from the only army that the IRGC is facing. 4 fighters killed in the Mahabad incident were part of the Kurdistan Free Life Party, or PJAK, rebel group. PJAK itself says. This public declaration is revealing in its own right. PJAK is outright saying that its fighters are battling against the IRGC. But the fact that the IRGC is having to deal with several different groups at once is even more worrying for the regime. That suggests collaboration, coordination, cohesion. And if all of these things are coming together now, it tells us that a front is opening up along Kurdish territory in Iran. A new front is rising, and there are 5 separate armies now united at its core. But we'll be getting back to that. Right now, what we're seeing here is Iran being delivered a terrible dose of its own medicine. For years, the regime has oppressed the Kurdish people in the mountains. Resistance has always existed. Now that resistance is beginning to blossom into something that Iran's regime knows it won't be able to handle. The writing is on the wall, and even the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, knows that he needs to get the regime's house in order so that it's ready to do something about the Kurdish threat. Khamenei's approach to the ongoing peace talks with the US tells us all we need to know about where his head is right now. Back on June 18th, Al Jazeera reported that Khamenei had signed the Memorandum of Understanding proposed through peace talks with the US, despite having initially disagreed with the contents. At the time, Khamenei said he signed despite his difference in opinion with Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian, because he wanted to safeguard the rights of the Iranian nation and the resistance front. Now we see a much different story emerge. A story in which Khamenei and his IRGC need to focus all of their resources on a war to come, rather than the one that they are fighting with the US. America isn't Iran's big problem anymore. The Kurds have taken that role. And in a moment we're going to tell you why all of this matters and explore what these initial sparks of the Kurdish rebellion could mean for Iran in the long term. There may even be a surprising role that the US could still yet play. But before we dig into that, this is The Military Show. We bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the bell to make sure that you see what we have coming up. So the Kurdish threat. Is it really as much of a problem for Iran's regime as this spate of attacks suggests that it is? To answer that question, we first need to dig a little deeper into the history between Iran's regime and the Kurds that have made the Zagros Mountains their home. That history isn't pleasant. Despite Kurds making up 10 to 12% of the Iranian population, they have been persecuted by Iran's regime from practically the moment that former Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei came into power. They have always been treated like a threat. For around 4 centuries, the Kurds have lived right where they are now in the Zagros Mountains. And though they've always had some sort of trouble with Iran's various governments over the years, the jihad that the elder Khamenei declared back in 1979 was the surest sign that Iran's regime wanted to get rid of them for good. Throughout the 1980s and even up to the present day, Iran's regime has mostly been able to keep the Kurdish resistance under control. Of course, there have been isolated attacks, but for so long, the Kurds have been scattered and their resistance underfunded and fractured, which has made it easier for Iran's regime to maintain control. But it's not just control that the regime and the IRGC want. As Genocide Watch pointed out in a November 2025 piece, the Kurds in Iran have been subjected to multiple attempts by Iran to limit their autonomy and force them into assimilating into the Iranian culture that the regime has created. Whenever the Kurds have spoken out about any of this, the result has always been brutal crackdowns. Kurdish political groups have been outlawed by Iran's regime, which prevents Kurdish voices from being heard in Iran's political structure. Civilian leaders are often arrested, stripping away the social tools that would allow the Kurds in Iran to organize any sort of peaceful dissent. Kurdish symbols are banned in Iran, so is the Kurdish language. Physically, it engages in arbitrary arrests, torture, surveillance, and hands out death penalties on an unimaginable scale, Genocide Watch says of the Iranian regime and its approach to the Kurdish population. That's the backdrop for what we're seeing in Iran right now. It's also the reason why many have suggested that it would ultimately be a Kurdish uprising that spells the true end of Iran's regime once Operation Epic Fury started. In early March, both the Atlantic Council and the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, speculated on whether the beginning of Operation Epic Fury could lead to Iran's Kurds mounting a true challenge against Iran's regime. The CFR suggested that the end of the US operation would signal an attempt by Iran's regime to crack down on groups within Iran that could be a threat. The Kurds are perhaps the most prominent group that fits under that umbrella, and that is motivation, if any more were needed, to start the uprising. The Kurds may still continue to resist the central government, and significant fighting may ensue. It's not uncommon for Kurds from other countries to come to volunteer their support to their Iranian brethren. Much would depend on Washington's willingness to continue standing by them and to persuade the Iranian regime not to seek revenge, the CFR said. We'll come back to Washington's potential role soon. The Atlantic Council took a more practical approach to its assessment, pointing out that the various Kurdish armed resistance groups in Iran are far from helpless, even if they were once fractured. These organizations have armed wings that are equipped with rifles, RPGs, and mortars that can be deployed against Iran's regime. Kurdish security forces also maintain several special operations units. One of those units, the Counter-Terrorism Group, has been trained by the US and has more advanced equipment, including M4 carbines, night vision technology, and sniper rifles. So the ability is there, and though a minority group, the fact that the Kurdish people make up around 10% of a country with a population of over 90 million people suggests that there is enough manpower to create a formidable unified army. But that brings us to the two things that we need to see for the attacks that the Kurds have carried out in late June to evolve into a more coordinated war against Iran's regime: opportunity and unity. The former has definitely arisen, all due to Operation Epic Fury. The absolute firestorm that the US and Israel unleashed on Iran, despite all of the geopolitical problems that resulted, has severely weakened Iran's regime and the IRGC. CBC reports that the US has managed to strike 13,000 out of an estimated 16,000 targets in Iran during its campaign. Those targets ranged from air defenses and warships to command and control centers that are vital to keeping the IRGC and Iran's army organized. More than 50 Iranian military bases have been damaged since Operation Epic Fury began, the outlet adds, and it's been suggested that Iran's military has been degraded to between 60 and 80% of its capacity. Iran International also reports that there is even talk about disbanding the IRGC, due to the group gaining greater power in the Iranian regime. Whether this would be a true disbandment or simply a rebranding exercise isn't clear, but the fact that it's even being spoken about at all showcases the disarray within Iran's military structure. That chaos creates chances for the Kurds to launch a large-scale campaign that, at the very least, could force Iran's regime to leave them be, or if executed well, could even lead to the crumbling of a regime that is still teetering too close to the precipice. The stability that Iran's regime needs to function well enough to stop an organized Kurdish resistance was already crumbling as mass protests over the state of the country's economy triggered everything that we've seen so far in 2026. Now, with so many regime and IRGC leaders dead, it's hard for Iran to organize the sorts of crackdowns that have kept the Kurds down for so long. However, opportunity must be married to unity. And that brings us back to something we mentioned earlier. We told you that there are 5 Kurdish armies all ready to fight against Iran. That wasn't hyperbole. Just a few days before the US launched Operation Epic Fury, an interesting development took place among the Kurds. 5 Kurdish Iranian political parties decided to unite to form the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan. All 5 of those parties have military wings, the Atlantic reports, and they all seem to be willing to fall under the overall leadership of the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, or KDPI. It's almost as though these parties knew that something was coming that would rock the Iranian regime to its core, and they wanted to be ready to take advantage. The US is also believed to have communicated with several of these groups as early as March 5th. That's when Al Jazeera reported that US President Donald Trump had spoken to the leaders of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, and the KDPI that we mentioned a moment ago. The unified Kurdish parties, which, we must remind you, the Iranian regime has tried to make illegal, also issued a call for Iranian military members to defect to their cause. That's an interesting wrinkle. Unhappiness with Iran's regime extends far beyond the Kurdish population. If this united group of Kurds can bring others onto their side, then the Iranian regime has a serious problem on its hands. In this, we see the confluence of unity and opportunity. And remember that these Kurdish groups are not amateurs. They're armed. Many of the members of their military wings are well trained. What we're now seeing in the Zagros Mountains region of Iran could be the beginning of a dangerous strategy that will cause massive problems for Iran. Kurds know those mountains well, certainly better than the IRGC. It's possible that the unified Kurdish militants are launching attacks against Iran's regime outside of their territory to bait the IRGC into launching an assault in the Zagros Mountains. If that's the case, then Iran is going to struggle. It will be bringing tanks and missiles to a fight where both would end up being useless. The Kurds know all of the natural choke points in their mountains. They can leave, launch attacks, then withdraw back into the cover of the mountains, inflicting damage against an Iranian military that has already been devastated by Operation Epic Fury. Whittle away at that military and the weakened regime may follow. And that mention of Operation Epic Fury brings us back to the US. America may yet have a role to play in the toppling of Iran's regime. No boots on the ground will come from the US. The country has already laid the groundwork for an uprising with its bombardment of Iran. What it could do now is provide the support that the Kurds need to finish the job. There were even suggestions that America was doing just that as far back as March 4th. CNN reported that sources it had spoken to claimed that the CIA was actively working with Kurdish resistance groups to encourage a popular uprising in Iran. This sort of thing is in the CIA's wheelhouse, and we know that the US has worked with the Kurds before. However, there are also signs that the US may not be willing to work with the Kurds. The Trump factor came into play several months after this report. In a June 16th piece, The Conversation claimed that the US has abandoned the Kurds, and Trump had plenty to say about the matter. The Kurds take. They have a great reputation in Congress. Congress says they fight hard. They fight hard when they get paid. I am very disappointed in the Kurds, Trump declared from the White House in May. It's always so difficult to get a beat on whether what Trump says is really what he means. But what we're seeing now in Iran could well indicate that the US is back on board with the Kurds. Peace talks with Iran have stalled once more, even after Khamenei signed a memorandum he didn't want to sign. Those peace talks being finalized would allow Iran's regime to focus on the Kurds. Maybe we're seeing some sort of political play here that nobody expected, as the US lengthens the peace process to give the Kurds time. Now we're seeing the Kurdish forces carry out coordinated attacks against the IRGC and Iran's regime across hundreds of kilometers of territory. Coincidence? Maybe. Or this could be the start of something much bigger, with the US working in the shadows to support a united group of people whose goal is to get rid of an oppressive regime that is weaker now than it's ever been. Iran isn't the only nation that is dealing with issues on its own territory. Thousands of kilometers away, Putin and his Russian cronies, who are allies of Iran, are dealing with issues of their own. Chechnya is barreling toward a succession crisis, and that could result in Putin having to deal with an internal uprising of his own. You can find out what all of this means if you watch our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show and hit the notification bell to see more of our coverage and analysis of the latest geopolitical developments from all around the world. And thank you, as always, for watching.